Okay, so we've just talked about what is sex, what constitutes sex, and understanding of what sex is, sexual intercourse versus sexual intercourse, the biology of procreation and that understanding. Now I want to talk about the importance of consent, because now we know what sex is. It's really important to know consent and the importance of consent. Okay? This one always gets me nice and tense because I feel so unbelievably passionately about it. Okay? The definition of consent, as per the dictionary, I believe this was the Collins dictionary. I'll double check that. Noun: permission for something to happen or agreement to do something. And the verb: to give permission for something to happen. So in this case, sexual intercourse. To give permission for sexual intercourse to happen, to permit somebody to have sexual intercourse with you and agree to the fact that you are having sexual intercourse together as two consenting adults. The next question naturally comes in. What is the definition of sexual intercourse? The act carried out for procreation or for pleasure, in which typically the insertion of a male's erect penis into the female's vagina is followed by rhythmic thrusting, usually culminating in orgasm, copulation, and coitus. So that's the definition of consent and the definition of sexual intercourse. Obviously, the definition of sexual intercourse is a little bit behind the times on account of the fact that it still refers to everything as male and female. I do like the fact that the Collins Dictionary did say usually and typically for the purposes of understanding that variations may be involved there, you know? But however, consent itself, in reference to sex, is an unambiguous, affirmative, and conscious decision by each person to engage in a mutually agreed upon sexual activity. Okay? The most important factors of consent are that it is informed consent, that the participants know exactly what's going to happen. They know what to expect of what is entailing within this. And if they're not comfortable, they can withdraw their consent. That it is voluntary, that participants are not coerced in any way by force or threats or any description of intimidation. And most importantly, with consent, is that it is revocable. Consent to one situation does not mean a free pass to have sex with that person whenever you want it. And very, very importantly, it is never too late to withdraw consent. You can withdraw it at any time, even in the middle of the act itself. If you are having penetrative sex, you can turn around and say, this is not what I want, and you can stop it. Okay? A long time ago, in the 90s, I believe it was, there used to be a slogan that was going around that said, no means no. And it was the way of going about combating sexual assault. That has since been changed, and there's a variety of different variations, but the one that I tend to stick with is only yes means yes. Only yes means yes. Because it is very, very easy for somebody who's feeling intimidated, who is not feeling, who may have anxiety, or is feeling nervous, or is not sure about how they feel about a situation, to stay quiet. And historically, that has been seen as consenting to an act when it is not consenting. Consent is never silent. It is never silent. It could be a yes. It could be a I'm game for that. It could be a I can't wait. But remember, it can be withdrawn at any time. Any time at all. It's also important to note that you cannot give consent when you are not of sound mind. whether that means that you are drunk, whether it means you are on drugs, whether it means that you've had a particularly stressful situation recently and you aren't of your right mind, whether it be because you are on various medications and you're not entirely sure about what's happening. There are a variety of reasons there that you cannot give consent. This is where it gets a little bit more complicated in regards to the fact that alcohol is quite often linked with people's first time. The idea of, as they say, Dutch courage. The idea that somebody uses alcohol as a way of boosting their bravery, boosting their confidence in order to do the act itself. However, if that person is drunk, and more to the point, as dictated there, not of sound mind, they cannot consent. They cannot consent if they are not of sound mind. And to be quite honest with you, if you are a decent fucking human being, there is no reason why you can't wait. You can't wait. Turn around and be like, do you know what? You're very, very drunk at the moment. I tell you what, we'll just leave this for the time being. If you still feel the same tomorrow when you're feeling a bit sober, or in a couple of days when you've got over your hangover, then we'll look at doing it again. There is never any rush. There's never any rush. This one, the next bit that I'm going to talk about is can be quite controversial, but it's something that I genuinely do believe in, which is I genuinely believe that you can pre-give consent. So you can consent for something to happen in the future with the understanding that consent can be withdrawn at any time, and it is always worth checking in to be sure. This one I feel quite passionately about because there is, honestly, if I'm completely honest with you, something that I absolutely love more than the vast majority of things in a coital engagement scenario is waking up to oral sex. Waking up and being like, oh, okay, this is happening. This is the thing. Way, fucking game on. Love that. Absolutely fucking love that. That's fantastic. And when I am with a partner, I will happily turn around and say, I pre-give you consent with the understanding that that consent can be withdrawn at any time. If I wake up and I'm like, do you know what? This isn't for me today for whatever reason. Maybe I've had a really stressful time. Maybe I'm just not in the mood. Maybe I'm feeling a bit ill. And I can turn around and say, do you know what? Thank you very much for trying that. But if you could stop, that would be great. That would be great. I'm not feeling it today. You know? We'll talk about the reactions of consent in a little while. Okay? Okay, so that's kind of like the most important aspect of like consent itself, in and of itself. Now, a lot of the time, people worry, especially if I'm completely honest with you. Usually, people of an older generation, that precise giving of consent isn't sexy. Like, to have to ask for consent isn't sexy. And that entire mindset is well and truly brought around because of the movies, because of cinema, because of media, because of the way that it is portrayed in movies. That these people are always ready for sex, that they're always happy to have sex, that they don't need to do it, they just need to look at each other, and boom, they have that chemistry, the fucking game on, let's go. They don't even need to do foreplay. They don't even need to, you know, wind each other's bodies up so that they're actually ready to do it. They're just like, boom, in it, let's go. This penis in this vagina, boom, 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 let's go. You know? And that idea of you shouldn't have to ask for sex is ingrained, especially in like I said, the old movies and what have you. They just do sex, and it's so unbelievably backwards. It's so unbelievably backwards because to me, there's nothing sexier than consent. There is nothing sexier than consent, and I always see it as like a mandatory sort of scenario, but it is, and you can make getting consent sexy? And people do worry about this, and I'm going to explain it now because I think it's really important, okay? How to make consent sexy is all about the energy of the delivery. The energy of the delivery. If you say things confidently, it stays sexy. If you say something along the lines of like are you sure? That implies that you aren't sure yourself. That you aren't sure yourself. You aren't sure whether you want to engage in it, which will immediately make the other person that you are with question, oh, do they not want to engage in this? Is that not the way it is? Is that not sure what the dynamic is? And it sort of puts a little jar in the entire atmosphere. However, you can reconstruct that by just a little bit more confident. A little bit more confidence, a little bit more assertiveness. Are you sure? Are you sure you want this? Or go a little bit more. Tell me how much you want this. Checking in while you're in the process of doing something. Does this feel good? Describe how this feels. Tell me how much you're enjoying this. Tell me what I can do to make you enjoy this more. All of these aspects are great ways to touch base, make sure that everyone's still comfortable, make sure that the consent is still there prominently between the people involved, and that it is still sexy. Because I feel like consent in this regard is seen very similarly to putting on a condom. Oh, well, I don't like to put on a condom because it slows everything down. Still very important that you put on a condom for the safety of yourself and the safety of the person that you're with. Oh, but it slows everything down. Then find a way to make that slowing it down sexy. It's easy enough to do with a condom. It's easy enough to do with consent. Just about taking that moment to touch base. You can even add it into something like teasing. You're doing something with somebody. You can see that they're getting all riled up. You stop and you go, are you sure you want this? Just at the point where they are enjoying it. That stopping actually adds teasing to the entire situation, but also gives you a moment to check in and go, are you sure you want this? And if they turn around and go, yes, give me it now, then you know to continue. If they turn around and go, actually, I'm not sure, I'm feeling this at the moment, then you're like, okay, no worries. We can do something else, or we can just sit here and enjoy ourselves, or if you would like to, I can leave. Whatever the scenario may be, do you know? On top of all of that, the sexy aspect of it, it is very, 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 very important to say that it is always okay to ask for a minute to say, look, I need a minute to collect myself. I need to take a breather and take a moment to decide if that is actually what you want. If that is actually what you want to do. For yourself, and you know, there's no shame in thinking that it isn't. And if it's something worthwhile that you aren't sure of at the time, you can always do it another time. There's always a point to do it in another time if it's with people that you know and trust, you know? The most important thing aspect there, and the most important thing with all of these little aspects is communication. Communication is key. Read the room, read the partner or partners, and if you're ever in doubt, ask. If you're ever in doubt, just ask. Just take a moment. Be like, do you know what? Is this what you want? Are you sure? Or take a moment beforehand and be like, are you sure you want to do this? We don't have to do this now. We can do it some other time. If you want to do it now, I'm game for it, you know? If in doubt, ask. Right. The next thing I wanted to do actually was show you a video. We'll show you a video. It's a very, very important video. And when it comes to the YouTube aspect of this, I will not show the video directly, but what I will do is I'll put the video in the video link in the description down below so that you'll be able to watch the video of your own free will. It also means that I'm sending you to them so that they get all of the content views and stuff like that over on YouTube. But I think this is a phenomenal video in regards to how consent makes sense. And I would love to just put this in my own words, but to be quite honest with you, I genuinely don't think there's a better way of putting it. I think the way that this video describes it is the best way of describing consent. And the video is called Consent. It's as simple as tea. Okay? I think that is a beautiful way of explaining consent in two and a half minutes. You know? Need a link to the video? I will happily put it in there. And like I said, for the YouTube, I will link it down below in the description for those people that are going to be watching this on YouTube. So yeah, so that's the best way that I've seen that can be described, that can explain consent in an easy to understand fashion. You know, it's just so simple. It's so unbelievably simple in that regard. The last thing I want to talk about in regards to the subject matter itself of consent is the trouble with enthusiastic consent, which is the problem with enthusiastic consent. And this really stems from a little while ago, there was a big thing about making sure that all consent was enthusiastic consent. And I fully understand that. The idea of somebody like biting their bottom lip and getting really anticipated, oh my God, the fantastic idea of getting with you because I consent and you're fantastic. You know, I want it to be really good. And the enthusiasm of being like, oh my God, I want to have sex with you. This is fantastic. And yes, 9 times out of 10, that should be the case. That should be the case because enthusiastic consent is amazing and it's very sexy and beautiful and it's a real thrill to have somebody actively be enthusiastic about the concept of sleeping with you, and I love that. I absolutely fucking love that. However, that doesn't mean that all consent is going to be enthusiastic. And the example that I'm going to use, because I think it's very important to talk about the fact that not all consent is going to be enthusiastic consent, is people trying for a baby. People trying for a baby. When a couple are trying for a baby, and I'm not going to speculate on the sexual orientation of this hypothetical couple because it really doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. When the people are trying for a baby and there is penetrative sex involved in that, penis in vagina sex, there are often times when it becomes difficult because of medical conditions, because of time of the month, because of the fact that you're just not conceiving and nobody is fully understanding why, where enthusiasm is nowhere near the consent, where you are having sex for the sake of having sex because that is the right time to have sex in order to get the best possible chance of conceiving a child. And it is hard. And it is really, really hard. And I know a few people that have been down that road. And I know a few people that have really struggled with the idea of enthusiastic consent because of that road. I'm sure there are other roads. I'm sure there are other reasons why somebody might not be enthusiastic about the consent, but still consenting all the same. And that is okay. But the example that I'm going to use there is if you're trying for a baby, you might not be enthusiastic about the consent. However, you are still consenting. and you can withdraw that consent at any time, and you are actively engaging in communication with your partner/partners, and it's all above board and what have you. It's all good and what have you. You can have, in reference to the tea video that we just watched, you can have tea without being enthusiastic about drinking that tea. Do you know what I mean? So that was the last thing I wanted to say on consent. Much shorter, a much shorter section of this sex education repertoire that we are collecting here, but still just as important. In fact, I would say it's probably the most important thing in the entirety of sex education, in the entirety of understanding sex education. If there's one thing that I can teach you to understand better, even if you understood it slightly well before, or you already knew all of this and I'm just hammering in a fucking point and preaching to the choir, if I can teach you consent, it is all worthwhile, because consent is the most important thing when it comes to sex. Even consensual, non-consensual has consent first and foremost, you know, which is, for those people that are not aware, the fantasy of sexual assault. I'm not going to go into it today by any stretch of imagination. I'm sure at some stage I will go into it. It's something that makes me feel particularly uncomfortable, but everybody involved in that situation is still consenting to the fantasy therein. Okay? Okay, I'm going to go and answer some of these questions now. Question from Liquid Sanity. Where can I find beginner oral tips on peens? Never done it, but want to try, but very scared. Good question. It's hard to state. I mean, you will get like all these different magazines and stuff that have the best tips for oral sex and stuff like that. There are a variety of different articles. However, each different person with a penis will have different sensitive areas. They will have different sensitive areas. We can certainly do I could probably do an entire talk like this on oral sex. To be quite honest with you, I could probably do an entire talk on oral sex, because it is quite convoluted, and it is different person to person. It is completely different person to person. The bits that are insensitive on one person are not the bits that are insensitive on another. However, I am all too aware that part of a person's, part of the problem with approaching oral sex is the worry. The worry that you are not doing things right. Especially if your genitalia is different to the genitalia of the person that you are performing oral sex on. And that really is where communication is unbelievably powerful. Unbelievably powerful. The fact that you can say, does this work? Does this not work? Tell me what you like, and I'll try and do it. One of the things that you can do very, very carefully and with somebody that you trust is, if you are not certain about oral sex, have them slide their fingers through your hair and help guide your head. Help guide your head. I'm more than happy to talk about this in more in depth on another time. But there's an awful lot that I could say about it. There's an awful lot that I could say about it. Realistically speaking, it really depends on what the sensitive parts of your partner are. And also, I would strongly recommend that you, once you start to feel comfortable with it, start to experiment a little bit. Because recently I've discovered things about pleasure that I didn't even realize I could do, like I could experience. And a lot of it comes down to shit that I didn't even realize was like sensitive to me and stuff like that. So there's a lot of stuff in there. There's a much bigger answer in that. If you are looking for stuff like that, there's loads of like cosmopolitan articles and stuff like that that are like, these are the best ways to be an oral wizard or whatever. However, to be quite honest with you, the easiest way to get good at head is to try it with a partner that you trust. Take it slowly. Explain to them that you are not comfortable with this, or that you feel very shy and very scared about doing it wrong, and you would love their constant input, constantly saying what looks good, what feels good, what feels good, what sensations are working, what sensations aren't. Tell them to tell you if they want more of one action or to move slightly or what have you. Another thing that's well worth doing, communication, both verbal communication, but the other thing that is well worth doing, especially if it's somebody that you are very intimate with and trust and love very, very dearly, hold hands. Hold hands. If you slide you slide your fingers in theirs, so you slide their fingers in theirs while you are doing the thing, you will feel their hand. Not everybody, because people are different, but you are likely to feel their hand twitch on bits that they like. It also increases the intimacy because you're holding hands while you're doing stuff. But the twitch is something that I'm aware that most people I know have. The twitch. Do you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean? Learn from porn and a dildo. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. Okay, next question. What is your opinion, and strictly opinion, as I do not intend to offend or upset anyone, but is there such a thing as non-consensual sex? Assuming that sex is something intimate and sexual assault, SA, most certainly I would not think is intimate. That is a very, very good question, excessive yielding. It's hard because, realistically speaking, by legally, when you're talking like the legality of it and what have you, sexual assault is still sex. It's still sexual intercourse, even if somebody isn't agreeing to it. By my definition, what we talked about earlier, there is a massive difference between sexual intercourse, sexual outcourse, and sexual assault. In regards to the intimacy side of things, I completely believe that there is such a thing as non-consensual sex. It's still sexual assault, but you can still have a very, very intimate, non-consenting aspect. One of the big things that I'm very, very keen on is exactly what I was saying before, is the fact that you can always withdraw consent. One of the issues that somebody may face with that is if the other person is very enthusiastically enjoying themselves and not wanting to stop. And at that point, something that was completely consensual becomes non-consensual. If somebody says stop, you stop. Or if you have a safe word and they do the safe word, you stop. Depending on the dynamic, but then we're getting into like BDSM and kink and stuff like that. But if you have a dynamic where you don't want stop to be the be all and end all, the stop area, then have a safe word. I mean, I would suggest that every couple, every throuple, every collective all have a safe word anyway, just out of sheer fucking safety more than anything else, hence why it's called a safe word. But yes, I do believe that a very intimate setting can be non-consensual. And I get where you're coming from, but I want to be very careful around that, you know? If somebody says stop, you stop. If somebody says the safe word, you stop. Traffic light system is always good. Yeah, green is go. Orange is, I'm not quite sure, I'm uncomfortable, check in with me again. And red is immediately stop. Next question. Can you share your thoughts on consent in a workplace where there is at least perceived notion of pre-consent through contractual obligation? Ooh, these are good questions. These are good questions. Shadow of the Wreck God, thank you very much for that. As I mentioned a little earlier, I believe that pre-consent can exist, but with the understanding that consent can be withdrawn at any time. And that's the important aspect. And I think that's something that I really want to hammer in. That consent, you can give consent at any point, but you can withdraw it at any point. You can take that consent away and be like, you know what? I'm not comfortable. I want this to stop. I want this to end over. Stop. Do you know what I mean? You mean in the sex industry primarily? Um, I can only talk about the sex industry that I am aware of, because I am friends with a fair few sex workers, and they've always got directors touching base with them. They either work for themselves, or they've got directors touching base with them, making sure that everything's okay, or they've got a liaison where they're touching base and everything's okay. Even movies these days have like a sexual director who is a person that makes sure that the vision that the director has doesn't increase on the comfort levels of the actors themselves. But you can pre-consent to something and sign the paperwork to do something, but at the end, I can only really speak for this country and probably America, and I would definitely, if you're ever in a situation like this, I would definitely 110% check the legal contract. But as I understand it, anything that causes harm supersedes any contractual obligations. Certainly in this country. Certainly in the United Kingdom. So anything that contracts as harm supersedes contractual obligations. So if you are contracted as a sex worker, as a porn actor, to do something, and you decide that it's not for you and it's not right and it's not okay, then you can withdraw your consent, and if it goes ahead anyway, then you can take them to court. It is always, it has to be said, and I hate the fact that I have to say this. I really am, it frustrates the fuck out of me that this is the case, but it has to be said. The way that the legal system, because of the way that the legal system, society, and all cultures at the moment perceive sex work, means that it is going to be difficult for... It would be difficult to pursue that in a court of law. And it's not because a breach of consent doesn't supersede the contractual obligation, because it does. That's the way that the law works. Like, harm supersedes contract. However, that's just to cover my own arse, that is my understanding of the way that the law is at the moment, and I will happily be corrected by a lawyer that understands the law of the United Kingdom better than I do. But that's as I understand it. But because of the way that society perceives sex workers, it would be hard to get them to back you purely because you're a sex worker, not because of the law. And that's where the real problem lies, because sex workers of every variety, whether it be lewds and nudes on OnlyFans, whether it be full porn star, whether it be actual walk in the streets and or arranged physical sex work, whatever that scenario may be, the sex workers are always looked down upon. Always looked down upon. Classic example at the moment with the I talked about this literally yesterday, the deep fake pornography, and the fact that all of these people are saying that it's really bad for these content creators to have had their faces stolen, and I completely agree. I am 200% behind the fact that it is really bad for these content creators to have had their faces stolen, but it's also really bad for the sex workers who have consented to sex work. They've consented to creating movies for the sexual gratification of others, but they haven't consented to have their faces covered. But I'm the only person that I know of that's talked about that. So yeah, that kind of I hope that answers the question a little bit. It's a bit of a hard one because I'm not 100% familiar with the legality side of that, but from what my understanding is at least of sex work in this country, harm supersedes contractual obligation. Okay, so Nibirin asked, I have my problems with enthusiastic consent, to be honest. As an ace person, which for those people that are not aware, that's an asexual person, I literally cannot work up to enthusiasm around sex because it literally doesn't matter to me that much. But I would feel devastated if I learned that my significant other feels unloved or rejected because I cannot get excited about having sex with them. So I never initiate because I frankly forget that it even exists. But I have no problem playing along if my partner desires to sexually engage. I mean, I fully understand that, and thank you very much for the example. Another example of why somebody might not be up for enthusiastically consenting to something. That's I never even considered an asexual point of view for sure, but that's really important because you're right. As somebody who doesn't have the sexual desire, if they're that kind of person on the asexuality spectrum, because some people do have sexual desire despite the fact that they are not, but despite the fact they are on the asexuality spectrum, it's just not desire for a specific person. But that's a much bigger conversation. And again, on the Thirsty Work podcast, we have an entire section. We have an entire episode dedicated to asexuality. So you can check that out on YouTube or your podcasting things. I think it's hard, especially as somebody who is quite sexual myself. I have always previously, before the podcast episode about asexuality, I'd always found it hard to understand like an asexuality perspective in that regard, because sexuality means so much to me, if that makes sense. Like sexuality and sex and sexual dynamic and all of that stuff means so much to me as a person. The idea of somebody not wanting to jump on top of me, I find very peculiar, and therefore I would think that if I was to date an asexual person, that would be a conversation that we would need to talk about. We'd need to talk about is the idea that they are never going to engage sexual intercourse because they forget that it exists, that they aren't going to enthusiastically consent because they have no real perspective on sex as an important, like it's not important to them, even if they do respect that it is important to the sexual partner, you know, the person who is sexually driven, not the sex drive, but sexually driven, you know. And so long as you've got that communication, you're going to get the best type of outcome. I'm not going to say you're going to get a perfect outcome, because I think I've not been in that situation. I don't know how that would work personally, but communication is the key in that, you know. I think it also depends on what you want to get as a sexual person. It depends on what it is you want to get from sex as well. Like, for example, one of the big things that I want to get from sex is the pleasure of the other person. Like, I pride myself on putting my sexual partner's pleasure first. And I get pleasure from seeing them in pleasure. And if they are a person who doesn't get pleasure from sex, I think that I personally would really struggle with that. So, a very interesting concept. Very, very interesting concept. And one that I certainly hadn't thought of before. So thank you very much for that, Nibirin. Is there anything else that you would like to say on the matter, Nibirin, while we're taking a moment for it? Because that's a really interesting dynamic, and you're right. It's another example of when enthusiastic consent is not correct. It's still consent. To me, it's all about the connection. Yeah. So that the intimacy between two people, and that intimacy can be. So the sex could be the most intimate moment that you have with them, but it's not the sex that makes it intimate. It's the fact that it's with them that makes it intimate. Yeah, I get that. Maybe I need to do another Thirsty Work podcast episode with another asexual individual to ask them more about pleasure and the dynamic therein, because I'm a hedonist and I fucking love pleasure. Do you know what I mean?